journalist. My career was in the newsroom. I was a news producer and reporter, and made my way into doing field research in the Middle East, and then discovered the world of user research at Dell when I lived in Austin. And since then, I worked for very small startups and for larger companies, and it's been a curvy road to Dropbox, but really fun. And I'm looking forward to sharing more tonight.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mikki. I have less exciting adventure than Paige and my path to UX research, but I think what at start, I see some familiar face of people who I talked to on UX Coffee Hour today, which is great. But what I've been telling people how I discovered UX research is when I was an undergrad. I was pre-med, actually. So I was kind of going around majoring a lot of different majors, not knowing exactly what I want to do. And then one of the course ended up changing my life, which is the Introductory to Human Factor Psychologies. And once I learned that the program was offered at my current university, one of the few in the nation on PhD, that kind of ended up like the big aha moment. So I ended up kind of disappointing my parents by not going to the pre-med route and ended up going to psychology route. And things since then, everything has pretty much lined up for me in terms of the user research world. And I've been doing UX research for over 10 years now. Primarily, a lot of the research experience, I've been working in the tech industry for Motorola, as well as I used to work for this, my research lab, which it was like a consultancy for a lot of different companies, like Dell is one of them, as well as Microsoft and Coca-Cola and so on. And then I ended up interning with Google, and they liked me enough that they offered me full-time before I get my doctorate. So once I did, I returned to my team that I interned with, and I have been here since the past almost 6 years now. And now I'm currently managing the Google Nest hardware team within the hardware services Google org.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those introductions. I think we can just get started for the million-dollar question topic of today. How can we all do better about aligning research with product strategy? Like I said, I'm so curious about this topic myself, and I'm sure folks here have tons of questions. But maybe we can get started sort of just to get things going with sort of the first subtopic in this section is, what if leadership doesn't view research as a worthwhile input to strategy? And maybe we can start there and kick things off.
Yeah. So I think that this is something that we're all trying to do in our job, which is to show the value of research. One very tactical way you can help leadership see is to look at past work and connect it to what impact it has made. So look at what your company or your startup, if you're a team of one, if you're a team of 50, has done so far, and connect it to what teams have been able to do. So maybe your research hasn't yet impacted a shipped product. Maybe it has, however, provided direction for the design team or for the product team to move forward in some fashion. So start making those connections and bring them up to leadership. Another thing I see as a component of that is to find an advocate in product that will also help advocate for research. And so you can bring them along with you to present to leadership the work that has been done and the impact that has been made already in past work. That's one tactical way that I see you can start that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Paige just mentioned. And one other things I want to add onto it is just to make sure as researcher, we take a step back first, asking why is there a negative perception of research in the first place? Oftentimes, I felt, in my experience, has been from two camps, right? One of those in which they have very little experience of working with UX research in general, so they don't know what to expect, or at least have very low expectation and see what all the great things we can offer. And then there's the other camp in which they have worked with UX research before, but they didn't get the things that they need. And that's the result. It's kind of like this negative perception, and then from like, it's not that very relevant or helpful to me at all. So I think understand which camp or the leaderships come from definitely set things in proper perspective. Because, for example, with the first camp who have minimal exposure to UX research, I feel there's a lot of things there that we can do from, from the ground up, like run small tactical study, as Paige suggested, of getting early buy-in, and then can see, we can catch the very low-hanging fruits and demonstrate our value, first of all. And then things just start ball rolling from there. But then the other camp is a little bit harder because it's about changing mindset, right? So they already kind of make up their mind along the way somehow, that because of negative past experience working with UX research or the team. So it's going to take much longer time to change that mindset. And I think it's about, similar to what Paige shared, finding what I call like our partners or champion, someone who's early on that we connect with, and partner with that person, so they end up helping us get more visibility or going around and kind of champion for us when we're not in the room.
Super helpful. I see that we have one question. It's a little specific, but I think the sort of the broader question, I'll start there and we can get specific as well. Is there a way to identify leadership sentiment about UX, whether it's a tool or just any other methodology, and sort of use that for our planning or for UX to strategize to move forward? Basically, like, how do you gauge leadership sentiment around UX?
One way to gauge it is just to look at whether or not you are in the product decision meetings. Are you part of those meetings? Are you part of those discussions? Do you know if there is a leader, if there is a research representative who is part of those discussions? And if there's not research representation in those meetings, you can probably guess that research might not be seen as a strategic arm. The other thing to do, like it was mentioned earlier, was to do like stakeholder interviews, to go and meet with stakeholders and ask them, very bluntly, what in your opinion, what's working and what's not working, and try to identify, sort of the underlying why behind them thinking that research doesn't hold value, and also try to understand their perspective a little bit more.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Paige shared. I felt stakeholder interview is something I regularly rely on, especially when I join new team, especially when they have no UX research priors. And I'm trying to understand, like, just to gauge the landscape of how the teams are currently viewing, what's their viewpoint on UX and research in general. I just have, although I think that the term stakeholder interview sounds very formal, but for me, I treat it as like very informal. I would grab a coffee, or I guess these days maybe virtual coffee, and then just chat people with calendar, like not with a specific agenda, but rather, I would like to get to know you better, as we're working together, and I want to understand, from your point of view, what things have you seen working so far from the UX and research perspective, and what things would you like to improve upon? I think I gather a lot of information, and then it doesn't seem as if we're judging them somehow, and that people can feel this is just an open space called conversation, rather than, it's like formally we're taking notes and things like that. Because I felt that the interview get into people's mind, user interview as if it's like a very formal process, but I just want to put out there that I treat it as very informal, so there's no pressure on the partners and collaborators that I have talked with, so that they can feel free and to be candid with me.
I love that point. Yes, it can be informal.
Yeah, and I'm sort of letting people in. Sorry if I don't know if everyone's also hearing the pings, but yeah, we can keep going. I have sort of a more personal question, and folks on the call who are just joining, if you have additional questions, you can either drop it in the Q&A tab within the sort of where you see the chat. If you're not seeing it, as I see some comments that if you're on an iPad, you might not be seeing it, just feel free to post your question in the comments. I'll make sure to read it and ask in the meeting as well. And sort of more, this is, I guess, like selfishly, my question around this topic is, sometimes I do understand that, like, if you have sort of a good amount of UX leadership, they're meeting with their product partners, and sort of they're bringing back the intel on like what strategic work is happening and how we can have that impact. But I think if you're on a sort of lesser staff team, or if you're in a startup, sometimes there's like, a lot of layers between you and the people that are making the decision, and maybe UX isn't represented there. I don't know if you have strategies to sort of navigate that.
Mika, would you like to go?
Yeah, I would like to open that since I felt you have more startup experience than I do, Paige.
Sure. Yeah, I think one way is to take a step back a little bit and look at what your research projects are and how they align to your company's mission and your company's goals. And start there. And I think by making sure that your projects are aligning in some fashion to that, like what are the OKRs? What is your company trying to run towards? And how is your project that you're working on, are the questions that you're asking going to help illuminate answers that get you towards that goal? And then I think that the other way is thinking about the socialization that you do for your research. So every time you do a research project, no matter how small you think it is, think about how you're socializing that work and to who your audience is. Because even if you're at a startup where you're not necessarily sitting close to the founder, every bit of strategic socialization of your work gets you closer to leadership. And maybe it's presenting your work for 5 minutes at an all hands, or maybe it's presenting it to the PM who will then be able to present it to leadership. So just think about like the strategic ways that you're socializing your work and how your work is laddering up to your startup's goals and mission to begin with, so that you're able to make that connection for leadership and they're seeing very clearly, oh yes, it makes sense. I understand why this work is going on.
Yeah, no, I also pretty much agree with what Paige say, and I think Megan ended up asking her questions whether socializations is similar to evangelization, which a lot of the parts is, right? Especially for those who, like I say, early stage maybe haven't bought into UX research yet. And I think if anything, just in terms of socializations, I prefer to do like in smaller groups. And for me, from the past experience, what ended up working really well a lot of the time is when I make that really solid connection with a key partners or collaborators. I felt when I do end up making that connection, the research I share resonate with those individuals. They end up actually on my behalf when I'm not in the room, was like keep mentioning about the research I did. And then as a result, that get more visibility upper leadership. So as a result, I felt a lot of time we might think, the larger things, that's what Paige mentioned, you get ourselves in a larger meetings or, like all hands, which is great. Definitely is a fast track, but don't be discouraged if you can't get in. Work on, that your key partners and collaborators, whether that's product managers, lead engineers or designer. Because when you share those and then you make sure, what you share ends up sticking with those individuals and they feel they can take actionable insight out of your research, they end up being your biggest advocates when you're not in the room. And that is what I refer to, like the word of mouth, right? We just need to make sure we work on this really great relationship with a few individuals, and those individuals will help spread the message on our behalf.
I love that word of mouth publicity for your research. That's great advice. I have a few questions building up here, so I'll sort of like take them as they're coming in. Unless either of you had anything more to add. Cool, I'll keep going. So we have a question here from Anna. How do you best track value of the impact of research done by yourself or a team? I think that's a fairly common ask that we get as UXRs, like, what is the impact of research? And, so how do you track that or show that, especially for tactical versus strategic or longer term projects?
That is a really great and a very, very important question that continue, I think, to keep researchers up at night all the time. I think different from design, right? It's harder for us to kind of pinpoint or really showcase our research impacts, because we're the middle layer between result. So as a result, sometimes our research impact kind of get lost in the muddle. For design, people can tie to, oh, this changing the button or layout increase in X number of like visitors or durations engagement on the website and things like that. Whereas we can't say that, our research directly impacted that increase of sale and things like that. But I felt what is important that I have been trying to get my whole entire team as well, the org, to start thinking is keeping track of the easier thing is which, what I call the quantitative metrics. So in like Google, we have like a lot of links that we have analytics that we can gather. So we can, very simple, like, how many reports viewed that my reports got and things like that. And then there's also, reshare as well. We can see how many people end up resharing. It's just the more quantitative thing that we can do. And then there's also internal research impacts. Other number is like, how many research were you able to complete this quarter versus previous quarter versus next quarter is something you can continue to keep track. But I think moving from the quantitative, the harder stuff to keep track, which I felt more impactful that show research impact, is actually the behavior qualitative things. For example, getting back at, difficult stakeholders or collaborator or partners. If we can get, one VP or upper leadership before have maybe not positive view of research, but then that person end up, during launch or larger meeting end up a big advocate, give kudos or shout out to the research. I think that is huge because we're changing mindset, and those things are equally important, if not more, to track. But definitely, I felt just because people are very gravitational towards number, it's easier for people to make sense. But I want to make sure people don't disregard the qualitative data that we collect, because I felt a lot of time those are more powerful. Because getting at one of my favorite quotes, by Dr. Maya Angelou, people don't remember what you say, right? People remember what you make them view. So I think keeping track of those stuff definitely, for me, demonstrate more research impacts than anything.
I think that's great. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think like what you mentioned a few minutes ago too about, you can't be in every meeting, and research is impactful when the meetings that you're not in, people are talking about your insights in that meeting, or they're making like product recommendations based on what they've learned from your research. Like that's a great measurement of research making impact. One other thing that we try to do at Dropbox is to follow the recommendation through to see the whole story and to like revisit your work. So in other words, your research has garnered certain insights and you're making recommendations based on that insight. You're following that recommendation through to see what happens with it. If you're embedded with the team, it's a little easier to do that. And you're looking to see like, does that end in like a strategy refresh, or does that end in like a change that is made on a product or a web page that's already out there, and then what happens as a result of that? And so following your work all the way through and making sure that you're following up like a few months down the line on what has happened as a result can also help be just one more like data point into research has been able to make XYZ change.
Awesome. And we have like a critical mass of questions building up here. So I'm, making sure to read these and ask them as they're coming by. I think we have an interesting follow-up on something that sort of just passed, but I'll ask anyway, is like when we were talking about, presenting and socializing, and it's really about finding more forums to just keep repeating your findings. And even if you mentioned, if you can't get into the big all hands, like focus on your key partners. Are there any other tips or strategies you've found to be effective in like, or advice that you give to your reports on like how best to present or socialize research effectively?
There's a couple of things I think about. One is to consider your audience. So, presenting your research findings to a group of PMs might look a tad bit different than presenting it to a room full of designers or a room full of engineers. So consider your audience, just as if you were writing a story and you're considering who's going to be reading your book. The other thing to think about, I think especially now, is we are online, we're on Zoom so much during the day, and we're reading report after report. And so the reports might not be as sticky. So think about like what collateral can you create as a result of your work that would be able to stick with your team. One tactical example is my team just finished this research project, and they created a picture that represents an archetype that their research found. And they gave the picture to everyone on the team to put as their Zoom background. And so for every meeting that that team is in, behind them is that like archetype and that one sentence insight from their work. And that's this like top of mind reminder of the insight that their research garnered. And that team is having meetings with other people outside of the org, and those people are asking questions about like, tell me about the picture behind you. And so they're becoming evangelists for the work themselves. And so think about like, how can you make your message stick beyond just your report? And those are some creative ways. And again, considering your audience is super important. You don't necessarily need to present your content in the same fashion to everyone. If you're doing an exec presentation, for example, keep it succinct. Make sure that you are, connecting it back to why you're doing the project and how it's going to help drive your company's mission and goals.
Yeah, definitely. Plus one to everything that Paige said, audience is definitely a key. I feel for a researcher I talk and mentor in the past who come from the academic background, one of the pitfall we tend to do from academic is like we just throw everything in the kitchen sink into the research report, and we have this really very optimistic view that people are gonna consume all of everything we've been working hard on, 50, 60 slide or so. Like, this is so amazing, people would just eat it up. And that is not the case, as Paige mentioned. I think, if anything, especially during COVID, our attention is limited and we are at capacity. So people attention is very low right now. So as a result, we need to be more creative in how we disseminate and share our findings and become less reliant on the typical research deck. And in the past, even before COVID, I felt for me, what's really sticking is making sure, like I say, just gather a small group of individuals and present to those individuals rather than have a large group. Because what I observe in the larger room is people also have lack of accountability. And as a result, people attention is kind of floating around doing things, and they're not focused as well. So when you have 3 or 4 people and you have maintain eye contact with them, right? As a result, they are kind of forced to pay attention to what you're sharing. And they also are forced to ask questions, which is a way to reiterate what they just listened and learned. So when for me and my team, when we have a smaller share out, and then we continue to share that out with smaller group, it's a bit tedious, but definitely the message end up more sticky than for us just gather everyone in the room and, like this, we say our piece, and then we hopefully people remember afterward, which is often not the case in my experience.
Just one quick follow-up on that, Mikki, and Paige, feel free to add if you have some strategies as well. When we're having these multiple smaller share outs, I've definitely seen value in doing that as well. Do you have any strategies on how you pick those people, like those 3, smaller groups of people?
Yeah, I think for me, it's similar to what Paige was mentioned. I make sure at least to get the key, for example, Eng, Lee in the room, right? Because they will have the same perspective. They will care a lot more of technical issue, and I would highlight those findings. Whereas if and then get a couple of few products or product marketing managers together in the room, because they also have similar mindset, because they care a lot about, sales, revenues, and things like that. So I would make sure to tailor that message to those audience as well. And of course, our UX designer friends and counterparts, they would care, like, not a lot of things need to be said there because they understand a lot. So they also are much interested in the detail of it, right? Regarding, how many people successfully go through this path or not. So definitely that's one of the benefits of kind of breaking people into smaller groups, make it easier for you to tailor the message and make sure the message is easily digestible by each grouping of partners.
Yeah, I think it depends on how big your company is, but when you're looking at the work that you've done, consider how each part of your company might find it helpful. So, you know, does your team do you have like a customer service team that that chats with customers who land on your webpage? Think about, like, are there ramifications from your work that would be really helpful for this customer service team to know? Should the marketing team know about something? Even your communications department, like, would it be helpful for them to understand something about your users that you just discovered? And so take and break apart those pieces. And even though it is tedious, it is a really important stepping stone to making the research be seen as valuable. Consider presenting your work or giving your work to each of those groups in a way that's personalized to them.
Yeah, and to add more to what Paige said, like for majority of my team members in our work, we actually have multiple decks for the same research that we find. So one year we present more for the exec, and then one for people we're working with, like Enschly and things like that. So don't be afraid of breaking your large research into smaller deck, and definitely make it much more easy for people to comprehend and appreciate all the hard work that we've been putting into the research.
Awesome. We have another question which sort of flows into our, the next topic that we had in mind is leading with examples, failures, and past successes that have sort of shaped your thinking around this. The question that we have is, can you give us an example of research that has actually influenced product strategy and how research got involved in the first place?
Yeah, I'm thinking about what I can and can't share, but yes, I can give an example. So we have a type of customer, a type of user of Dropbox that we had long considered as possibly important to the product, but we didn't necessarily understand the role that they played in deciding whether or not to use the product. So if you're on Dropbox and you pay for Dropbox and multiple people use it, then you might be what's called an administrator. You're an admin. And so we had an idea about the role that they played, but we really weren't super certain. And there had been some assumptions made about the role. And this is a really tricky part of our work, is when our stakeholders start making assumptions and they become so strongly held that they feel like fact. And so I sat down with my data analyst and we looked at what the data was showing, and we realized that the data actually was showing something different than what people had been assuming was happening for such a long time. And that activity in itself opened up a research project that led us to find insights regarding our admins that ended up changing the direction of efforts that our company was making towards these admins. We discovered that the way that they make purchase decisions wasn't the way we had assumed they were making them, and that the strategy that was in place in addressing this group of people actually was not necessarily going to work given the information that we found out. So it was something that I think was incredibly impactful for the company. Part of what made it impactful was the socialization aspect of it. So we thought long and hard about how to socialize this work in a really strategic way. When I was planning out my project, we had a calendar in our paper doc that listed out the dates in which we would socialize, so that our stakeholders were also seeing that, we're going to take 2 weeks to do heavy socialization. We're going to commit to that time. And so we were setting expectations from the beginning about that. And then we thought about the groups that needed to see it and who we needed to work with to get in front of those groups. And ultimately it paid off. It was definitely, I would say, a cross-collaborative effort, but it started with partnering with my data analyst partner and looking at, like, what is the landscape telling us, because these assumptions may or may not be true.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me is a lot of the research that influenced product strategy from my experience are the one that often was not even asked in the first place. It stemmed from foundational research when I talk to different partners and collaborators, where I see things are not aligning and there's gap, and then people are very silo where they are, so they couldn't see this 1,000-foot view where I was able to see. So as a result, I will end up just initiating the research, whether or not there was original research request for that, because I see there was a need. And I can recall one specific example is when my previous team, when I was the first researcher to join the cloud AI machine learning team, at that time when I was in the space, there was little UX researcher anywhere in Google or even outside that were doing machine learning, very technical works. And even when I start working in that space, a lot of our cross-functional partner were wondering why research even needed or why UX was there, because what they are building has no interface. We were using command line for a lot of things. But when I talk with a lot of our key collaborators, partners, as well leadership, I realized that everyone have a different profile in mind of who are the machine learning practitioners. And I felt that was the missing gap. It's like we cannot build a really great product if different leaders are misaligning on who they think we're building it for us. So as a result, I kickstart this month-long diary study in which we're trying to uncover all the machine learning practitioner in academics as well in industry and what they are doing, their pain point, the tools they are using. And afterwards, when the research was shared out, and I make sure multiply, to follow back through with multiple workshop and include a lot of those key partners in the room to have conversation, that when things really blooming and people were seeing, hey, this is huge opportunity that we're not seeing. We're actually have different machine learning process in mind and what people are actually doing. So I think highlighting what's felt obvious after was very important from research. And this is why I'm a big advocate of doing a lot of foundational research, because I felt that's the value of research rather than, tactical, which is great. But I felt we're just not there at the end. You to tell people whether, this thing is pretty, this thing is working or not. Our value is telling people which direction they should even go towards to before they even start heading toward that direction.
Those are both great examples, and sort of flipping that on its head, is there something that y'all would suggest, like just based on experience, either could be examples of failures or even things that y'all have stopped doing in order to become more strategic?
This is so tactical, but I don't know that we do this all the time. The first step is knowing what your company's or your area's product roadmap is. Like, what is it? Regardless of whether or not research is currently playing a big part in it, just know what your product roadmap looks like to begin with. Know the OKRs of your area. Know the OKRs of your company. Know what they're trying to currently drive towards, whether or not that's the wrong thing or the right thing. Just start there. I will admit that in the beginning of my career, especially, I was not necessarily so keened into and honed into like what my company's OKRs were. And I didn't really know what the area that I supported, what their product roadmap looked like. And I can't really speak to that, and I can't really understand how I can help it if I don't know what it looks like. And so, start there. That's step one.
Yeah, for me, one of the big lessons I learned is that to get more visibility into the role what I'm doing as a user researchers, because I felt there are a lot of people who are not in user research. I learned from a lot of conversation I have with different people. They feel like we're like a big mystery box, and somehow, we're just sitting there magically with a wand and churning out reports like, Harry Potter is a type of thing. Like I wave my wand and instantly there's a magic report just churning out. But once I realized that was the key thing that they were not seeing, I make sure to give them full transparency into all my research planning process. So I loop them in every step of the way. So from the very beginning, when we're planning, make sure to let them aware, like how long does it take usually for we to get in recruiting for participants and things like that. And then how long does it usually take for, for us to start scheduling interview and things like that. And as well as every step of the way, kind of check back in for them. And then one thing my team and I did that was super successful is like during all of our smaller chunks of user interview, we send out a really quick, what I call like research flash. But we posit, this is very top level of the mind trends, and this is not an end all be all analysis, but we just want to make sure we give people visibility what we're seeing right now as we talk to 3 or 4 user right now, and then the next day 3 or 4 user. As a result, people have already bought in because they are constantly feel that they've been looping every step of the way, and there were no surprises. So once we share up, ultimately the findings, people were like, oh, I heard this because I've been following what you've been sharing. So as a result, people are less likely to push back a lot of this finding. And then people also feel they are part of the research process because they can see full visibility. For example, one of the things I gave people visibility is I started a research calendar for my team. So people can always go in and see what my teams and I are running at any time. So they really see all the works we're doing with. And then on my end as well, I did research roadmap for the entire years because I partner with other leads, kind of planning out what research is needed. So they can always be fully visible at any quarters, like what are we working on? And then use that as the kind of, for me, asking for more headcount or budget at the end of the years to see like, hey, we have more research requests than we could handle. But then on their end, they could also let us know, like, are we working on the right impact stuff on their end? Because if not, maybe we should stop dedicating resource on this one and ship it elsewhere. So that's a lot of the things I've been doing, just give people more visibility in what research is doing, what they felt a lot of time is like mystery box.
I love that example of like it being us doing work as though it's like a huge mystery. And sort of on that topic of how we as researchers we don't always like share all of our processes broadly, and doing that can help. We have a question here from Apteen. Sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly, but it's on the topic of how do we get to do work that is using novel methodologies. For example, when it comes to quantitative, how do you convince your stakeholders to try something different, especially if they are more comfortable repeating same methodologies, read surveys and interviews?
I think this getting at my other question regarding my other point regarding, do things without asking for permission. Because a lot of time people are used to seeing what they are seeing. So they are only asking what they are used to know, right? So they don't know anything different if they are not seeing anything different. So that's why I felt like if I were to, rely every time for my collaborators or partners to tell me what research I should work on, I am not doing an effective job as a researcher, because I felt that's the power of research. We are able to see from 1,000-foot view all the different partners we're working with, and we can piece those into a larger picture that people are not seeing because they are siloed off. So we definitely are there. So we should be pushing for research that we feel is important, and not relying on our partners telling us which research we should do. So as a result, usually I just end up going, for the research and then let the results speak for itself by the end. Because once people see it, then okay, this is exactly what I want, but they can't tell us prior, right? Like, this is what I want. So oftentimes I know that there's a big thing, people who we work like for product manager are really, really into survey a lot of time, and it's hard to move them away from it. For example, just the net promoter score is something I keep hearing over and over again. It's a really great measure, metrics, but it's not the only metrics there is. And to get people out of that mindset is for me to pair that metrics with something else that they aren't seeing it, and then they can make the correlation to see how it's very similar. And actually the qualitative adding this really that rich data that we're not getting from like NPS as a whole, right? Which is how many people are you likely to recommend to your friends and family and so on, but you're not understand why people are doing it, or as to why people aren't recommending us. So tying that to a very qualitative piece is the way I usually try to pair it together, something they're familiar with and then something they don't, as a way to can get easier acceptance and buy-in.
I love all of those ideas. +1 to them. I just wrote a paper doc about the CES metric actually, and why you should pair it, with NPS. It's not either or. And one thing that I found to be helpful too in the project docs that we create is actually just dropping in a very simple table that lists out the methodologies that you're using and why. And so for your team, they're seeing, we're doing a diary study because it's going to help us answer this. And we're doing a code design workshop because it's going to help us answer this. And I totally agree that like when they see the end result, they're hopefully getting what they were asking for or what they didn't even know they needed in the first place. But I found that by also just highlighting like, we're doing a diary study because, seeing this behavior over time is going to help us XYZ. To the different methodologies that can be used, and I think just helps iterate that it's not always interviews and surveys. There's a whole toolbox of things that we can use to get at a question, and so I found that to be effective.
Yeah, that's again super helpful. Let's see, we have a question here about there's a couple of questions on convincing stakeholders, but I think we've sort of like addressed that. So we can sort of go into something that you touched upon in terms of like how you plan your research and sort of the roadmaps. I think I've been on different teams. Every team has like very different ways of how research is planned. Some are much more collaborative with stakeholders. Some are more research coming up with their own roadmap and sort of sharing that out for feedback. I was just curious, like with coming back to sort of a topic for today is how do we get more strategic with our research? How does planning work with the teams that you manage, and what are some strategies that you found to be effective to make sure we're continue to stay strategic?
Yeah, for me, I get to the same point that every time I make any edits, I make sure to loop in the leads so they are aware of those edits, right? And they get a chance to tell me, are we heading the right path? Or is this research aligning with our larger product strategies and so on, which is very important. Because even though I was saying, we should focusing on a lot of the research that's not asked for, at the end of the day, we are, since the org we're sitting under, right, the people who end up like paying our paycheck at the end of the day, we definitely want to make sure we do a lot of the research that's get at the product strategy, whether or not it's clear from the person from the get-go. But ultimately, the research findings should fold into the larger research strategies. And so that's why I want to make sure that I always loop back, and I have regular, what I call one-on-one with all the leads, at least, if not bi-weekly, if not monthly, to check in, because the org that I'm working with, things are changing constantly all the time. So if I don't stay on my toe and making sure I loop people in and constantly get updates, thing will easily fall through the cracks, and my team will end up working on something that's no longer relevant, or wasting a lot of resources and my team time, for example, because they will be spending a month on doing research that end up saying, hey, we no longer care about this product. This is no longer important. So for me, I always make sure that I continue to have very close connections and one-on-one with all the leads. So that way they will help inform me whether our team are still aligning with the larger product strategies.
Yes, that's super important. Similarly, we're making our roadmap in conjunction with our leads and our partners to be sure that we're putting the right things in our roadmap, and we're then socializing it. So since I'm in growth research, we're socializing it amongst the growth org so that they can see it. It's a paper doc that's living and breathing, and they have a link to it, and we give them the expectation that it will be changing because things change, but they also have this like single source of truth that they can go to see what we're working on in a given time. Within the actual framework, I know there's a lot of different frameworks that people might use. A couple of things that we use in ours. One is that we have a column that it says like, what strategic pillar does this map back to? And so it is very clear that like this research project maps to this strategic pillar. So there's no question about like how it is going to help drive the org forward. The other thing that we use is like the P0 to P2 priority definitions. So like, is this something that if we do not work on, it's going to actively block work for multiple teams? Or is this something that we need in order to execute future projects? So that we're also prioritizing the research projects. And again, it's in our roadmap, so it's very transparent for everyone to see. And it also serves as like a gut check for me when I'm talking to my leads to understand, like, does this project need to shift in priority? Do we need to shift resources in some capacity? Like, are we still working on the right things?
Yeah, just to add a little bit on what Paige I forgot to mention was at Google, we have like a similar priority grade in which we base our priority grade on the engineer team, and like things like P0, which is very, very important, all the way to, P3 that might be, not as important, but nice to have. So we make sure to grade all of the research projects by that. And then we let the team letting us know, are we aligning in terms of our priorities, right? And they would tell us, whether we're not, but if anything, I just lay it out and then waiting for people to tell me that I'm wrong, because I think that's the nature of things. And that has been really, really helpful, because unless people see it, they can't tell us, that we're wrong. Because I think one of the mistakes I make in the past is just like letting them tell me what research is needed or which one is important. But then that takes too much time out of people's hands, and as a result, people are less likely to have that conversation. So I end up feeling the better methods for me just jotting down based on my conversation with people, and then waiting for people to tell me that I'm wrong, which is end up working much more better, because people have harder time with, having things from conception of telling you what things you need to work on, but people are more than welcome to tell you, this is the wrong things to work on. So having something to start off definitely help people giving that feedback.
Yeah, loving all the advice and loving all the questions too, guys. We're sort of coming up towards the last 10 minutes. So I think this is where we wanted to get through most of the audience questions. If you haven't posted, feel free to add questions. I'm still sort of making my way through these and sort of get the ball rolling. There's an interesting question and it's probably more IC focused, but feel free to share your experiences as well. How do you avoid the tendency to tailor the research finding to sort of back up the direction that your product team, is sort of pushing towards, or, everyone's banking on like launching a feature? How do you sort of come in and still deliver the hard truth as a researcher?
This is a really, really great question. I think this is something a lot of the research I talk to with different orgs and then with different companies constantly face. I think if anything, I can talk about what I recently read by Molly Stephen, who's a former Googlers. I believe she's now the director for Booking.com, but she wrote a great Medium article on this, and how as long as research is sitting under one of the major pillar, it's hard for us to be really, really productive and be really unbiased in our perspective, because whether we're sitting under products or engineer or design, right, we're privy to that work and that perspective and that lens. So as a result, whatever research findings we end up presenting has to somehow cater and fit in the perspective of that work, which is the unfortunate things. And what Molly ended up championing for, which I totally am on board with, is we need to start thinking research as its own separate org. Like, we can still sit with products, but as the larger leadership, we should not report under, like engineers or product manager, and it's really equal footing. Like for me, this four-legged chair rather than a three-legged stool that people typically think of. I think oftentimes people associate research inherently with design as a natural things, which a lot of the keys do work, but then there are a lot of time there's not, because I say the value of research is in foundation. doing a lot of foundational research. So as a result, we can tell people, what they should even start building before they start building it. And for us to do that, we need to be a separate, or we're not reporting to any particular leadership, right? In which we have to cater our research finding to make sure we coax, our audience, right? And say like, hey, the engineering team is building in the right paths, or, product manager has the priorities straight in which the products we should market or launch next year, or like, this is the great design that we should work with. So I think to the larger, like broader questions, I think this is something I still am continue to try to solve, because it's hard. We can be as much unbiased as we want to think, but at the same time, we're still pretty much operate under this larger org that has greater control over us, right? And then they also have the power to silence a lot of our research findings if it is not resonating or aligning what their objective is. So I think, to larger perspective of, during this time where people talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is why I felt it's very necessary for a lot of companies to start considering this 4-legged chair rather than a 3-legged stool in which we make research its own separate orgs.
I could totally get on board with that. I love that idea. I totally agree. I think it partly comes down to company culture. Like, is the company itself making space for hard truth? Because sometimes our research projects do garner some harsh realities. And so part of it is company culture. I know that this was more of an IC question, but like, as a manager, one thing that I can do is make sure that my team has permission and has space to come back with research that is not necessarily going to be music to the ears of leadership. It might be that we find out that something is really not great going on. And my leads, I can help my leads also create that same space and help them understand why. Like, yeah, maybe we're going to hear something right now that is going to change what we're thinking and move our direction. But ultimately, the goal of research is to do, to create, shed insights that help us create a great experience for people. And if we're working towards that, then we're only going to be helping the company. And so I think helping my leads also make space so that the researchers are getting permission to present things that aren't necessarily great. And then I guess just the one other thing that I think of is like, it's especially difficult sometimes when you work at a company where people feel like they are the user. And it's important to remember that we could have used that product very, religiously beforehand. But the minute we step into that company and we become an employee, we differ ourselves from the user. We become atypical. And so from that point on, we're not the user. And so reminding our partners that can also help, I think, in like giving space and giving permission to bringing back research that doesn't necessarily just like fit in a pretty like product box.
Yeah, I definitely love that message that Paige reminding of. I think that's something I definitely constantly try to get people to understand across the org, right? Every one of us is a user, but we're not the only user. And it's very, very important that people understand, because sometimes people lose perspective of that. Every one of us feel like, oh, other people are just like me. But as the case, we're definitely not, or a lot of us are like diverse in our perspective or background. So not everyone going to be like us. So to remind people to take a step back and realize, and then making sure people have full transparency into the participant recruitment process and the demographic of our participant, so they can see how diverse is our participant and how representative of whatever market we're trying to enter or measure from the products. And I think getting back to the original question too, one of the strategy I would work is to make sure to avoid confirmation bias as much as possible, is to not be so knee deep with products and understand like all the details, and then kind of like separate yourself, like coming in as a naive person, right? Asking a lot of the questions and not knowing a lot of the history behind definitely help, because when we know too much, it's the curse of knowledge, right? We end up like assuming so much. And I felt what's the value I add early on when I join like any new team is, for me, I'm not afraid of asking a lot of stupid questions, or it seemed like, but then when I ask them, people realize that, hey, you know, every one of us has different answer for supposedly her simple questions, like who are the user, that type of thing. And when I ask those questions and people thought they know the answer, they realize that they don't. So I think if anything, from the researcher perspective, is trying to make sure we're not becoming the expert of the products we're trying to do research on, making sure we still have this naive perspective about it, so to avoid that confirmation bias trap.
I think this was, it was an excellent question and an excellent set of answers to it. Definitely resonated with me as well. Like a lot of times we think, oh, it's my bad, you know, my product team doesn't get it. But I love that both of you also highlighted that there's a culture change required. And, you know, hopefully we'll all see that in our careers at some point. Looking forward to it, fingers crossed. We'll make it happen. We're like, you know, 1 minute at time, so I don't want to go over. And I think we've sort of mostly answered most of the questions in some form or the other. For those of you who feel like you've asked a question that has not been answered, I am saving these questions, and UX Coffee Social will happen like, you know, in a regular cadence. The next one should be coming up in 2 to 3 weeks. So if it doesn't get answered here, we'll try to address it in a future session. I just want to, you know, take some time to thank both of our panelists today, Mikki and Paige. This has been an amazing session. I found it very helpful myself too, and you can see in the comments, if you haven't already, like people are sort of really like happy with sort of some of the advice you've shared. Thank you for making your time. And for all of you who attended and asked questions, awesome. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for helping facilitate a great discussion. And I'll share a recording out in about a week or so, just, you know, making sure it looks clean and everything makes sense. Look out for that on the LinkedIn channel.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. If anything, like I said, if any of these resonate with you and you want to dive deeper or you have more questions, feel free to grab a time slot with me on the UX Coffee Hours, and I'm more than happy to chat more regarding any problem you're facing, and we'll see how we can best tackle them together.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Phan, for hosting it.
Yeah. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care.